I'm aware, friends, that we've been holding a lot in 2025. As we know, with the upheaval of our building, it happened and correspond right at the turn of the year. In addition, as things have transpired in the new administration in January, each of us from week to week are looking desperately for the actions that we can take as individuals to counter into a space in which we see so many hurt. We see so many policies that seem to marginalize others. And we're working mightily, as we did through May, looking for those things to put love into action. And I've heard from many of you throughout this time, collectively, ongoingly, what can we do together? It feels like not a short race, friends. I went on a 5K with Phoebe this morning for a mother-daughter experience around Hickory Ridge. We made it through. I got a bracelet. And it was short in the grand scheme of things. It was wonderful to train for it, to get our bodies ready, and to be in the spirit of that relationship together and to find our way to the finish line. But sometimes, friends, we get the sense that even as we're training up from day to day in these months that have been a part of our journey, we get the sense of the truth of the marathon that is before us. And we come back each week to these Sundays in order to fuel up and to recharge and to get energy from one another so that we can continue to go out and do the things that we can into the world that God has created, that we can share the love of Christ that Jesus has instilled in us. What I want to share today feels big to me for many reasons. And what I'm going to share is not one act of resistance that we can take tomorrow and feel like we've been on that path, but it is an invitation to be in a space of ongoing relationship. We've been in a time in our country where there's been an ongoing effort to silence painful parts of our nation's history. And I believe as we go forward that we have an opportunity to remain curious, to lean into a space of ongoing reckoning and restoration. So this feels big to me, and I feel like you're a big part of this story, and it feels like something that can't remain in the tomb, especially in Easter, and it certainly can't remain on a dusty shelf. As we've seen with our dusty shelves downstairs, sometimes we have to re-examine what's on them, come to terms with what's there, and then lean into the hope that God has for us. And it is out of that space of hope that I want to chart this story, so please bear with me. I'm going to try to do it mostly just from the heart, because that's where it resides. Last spring, I had the opportunity to meet a man named Adam Green. I was calling up Wellspring Day Center over in Germantown. It's right next to Dayspring. It's one of the retreat centers of Church of the Savior. And as I called, I was thinking towards the fall, and might they have space for us if we weren't going to be on campus? And I called and I talked and I said, will you have space? And they said no, and I thought that would be the end of the conversation. But I got to talking to Adam, who it turns out grew up in this area and was working there at Wellspring, and he said to me, you know, it's interesting that you're calling from Columbia because I just had a dream about James Rouse. And I said, tell me more about that. And 45 minutes later, both because he was so wonderful at giving descriptions about the dream that he had had, but because I was so captivated by what he was sharing. And so it was that we began just email back and forth. Sometimes events were happening at Wellspring, and I invited him sometime to come to our carriage house where the Stones are still speaking to us. And over time, he was looking at transitioning from that job at Wellspring, and he has a new job now. So he came here with his partner, Robin, one evening, and I don't know if you've ever been in the carriage house at night, but it's just a little bit different than when it's in the day. There's something that's an added layer of potential mystery and majesticness. And so we gathered around one of our cable tables right here in the middle of the room, and I welcomed them into this space. We're talking about different ways in which they're now working closer to this area. It turns out his partner, Robin, works at the Harriet Tubman Cultural Center down the road, an opportunity to be in connection there. And Adam was telling me that he now works for the Piscataway Indian Nation. And in working with the Piscataway Indian Nation, he is looking to be in the space of continual community building and connection. And as we were talking, I'd been thinking with different folks at KC about speakers to come, both in the spring and throughout the year. And I said, I'm just wondering if someone from the nation might like to come and speak with us sometime. And he said, yeah, no, I could see that being a potential. Let me go back to my folks at the Piscataway Indian Nation and have a conversation with them. And that's how we left it that evening on that holy night. It wasn't too long after that I got an email back, and it said, I met with emissary Arif Al-Apache, and he said that there's interest there. But he also said something that really hit home as I read it, and it made so much sense to me. Because here I was, as we typically do when we want to learn something more culturally, we say, come on in, come to our space. We'll receive and consume what it is that you have to say, and that will be good. And he asked two things of us. He said, if we go there, if one of us goes there, is there an acknowledgement that you're on what historically were Piscataway Indian Nation land, Piscataway Conway tribes, unceded here in this area where we are in Howard County and throughout southern Maryland and beyond? And is there recognition that the name that the church holds is that of the ancestor of our current hereditary chief of the Kinamakundi branch, and then now into the Piscataway from the 17th century? And I sat with this because I knew that there was more to the story than I necessarily had in my own knowing. At one point on a Wikipedia page, I'd looked up and seen that Lake Kinamakundi, there was an acknowledgement that we think that it means one thing, and then they were saying, oh, but it might mean this something else. And so I sat with it, and I called up Ken Katzen, who's our resident archivist. Now, if you might remember, if you were here at the 50th anniversary back in 2019, Ken had done a lot of work with the Name Them project, helping us to identify names of those who have been enslaved on the property, and that is an ongoing process that is continuing. But in the context of that, we had acknowledged the Susquehannock and the Piscataway as part of our acknowledgement of the land that has, for generations, seen different occupants and certainly colonialists. So Ken and I started to dig deep. We created a Google Drive folder, and we started putting articles and things that we found. And as we were thinking about it, I knew from the beginning that what Arif Al-Apache was asking wasn't simply, oh, have you read some articles? He was saying, if I come there, are your hearts ready to receive? Essentially, have you done your homework? Have you done your work? Have you done what you can to know about where you come from? And I believe that there may have been many of us over time in the KC tradition that have asked questions, maybe learned some things, but I hadn't heard any origin story about where it is that this adopted through, except to know, in which I think that many of us would know, that Lake Kinamakundi here in Columbia is right there where the Whole Foods is, and it was named in 1966 through the Rouse Corporation. So Ken had reached out to the archivist at Columbia Archives to find out more, if there's something written down that we could know about. And so in that process, he had worked with a woman over there and then been emailing, and come to find out that they were aware that Kinamakundi, even though it was named at the time. So someone wrote in, you heard this story where James Rouse and the corporation had said, hey, community, we're naming a lot of things in this new town that we've got. Like, we got all these street names, we've also got landmarks. What are your suggestions? And so we don't have the original suggestion as it came in, but what we do have is just the acknowledgement that someone wrote in at some point and said, Kinamakundi, it has a native ties, and it means a meeting place. And so that resonated, because here they were creating a meeting place, and I think to some degree wanting to try to honor a history of some of what was known, some of what wasn't. We know that it's a complicated history because there was the buying of farmlands. Some were a little bit more in on what was happening, some weren't. There were historic properties and less historic ones. And so this was a complicated process, but the name Kinamakundi stuck with them as a meeting place, and it kind of became a symbol then for the community that was gathering. And at that time, they knew it had native ties, and thinking it was tied to some of the folks who had been in Howard County the longest, they said Kinamakundi. There was not evidence that they had reached out to the Piscataway Conway at that time. And on RFL Apache, as we were emailing, as we kind of shared a little bit more about what we'd found out, he said that he had talked to the current chief, Mark Tyak. Tyak is the name for chief. And he had no remembrance of Columbia reaching out either to his father, Billy Redwing Tyak, or to Billy's father, who would have been alive at the time, who was Turkey Tyak, who was very responsible in the 1970s for Native revitalization here in this area and also across the country. There are pictures of Turkey Tyak down on the mall when the National Museum of American Indian, I believe it was Billy, I don't know if Turkey was still alive, but they were there and helping into that process. And it wasn't that long ago that the Columbia Archives had reached out to the National Museum of American Indian because they had discovered that Kinamakundi, well, in the original language, it comes from the Algonquian. It doesn't mean meeting place. Now, it's confusing a little bit because at one time there was a Kinamakundi parcel of land, a township, because Kinamakundi, the emperor, who was over several of the tribal regions, that name of which he occupied in the 1630s was named after him. So it was Kinamakund area, right? So we can see how that had gotten attached to a physical kind of location. And maybe at one time people knew it to be a meeting place because that was part of what their village was. But to know that it attaches to a person, and that person has a significance in the history of a people, that part did not seem connected. And yet, when Ken and I started doing the reading, of course, there he is. He's on the pages of history, and what a colorful history it is. Largely in the southern part of Maryland. At one point, he converted to Catholicism, and he was very interactive with the European settlers who would have been coming in that very same season in the middle of the 17th century. He didn't live terribly long, and it was complicated, the ways that he was interacting with the European settlers and what that meant for his people as they were continually forced to migrate to different regions. So I come back to that moment. Would our hearts be ready to receive an emissary from Piscataway Indian Nation? Oh. Adam encouraged us, even if we didn't feel like we perfectly had things in a space or hadn't been able to move it forward, to just simply have a conversation on Zoom. Ken and I, representing KC, and Adam, emissary, and RFL Apache, emissary to Piscataway Indian Nation. And so earlier in May, we got together online. And here's where my voice is probably going to slow a little bit because I want you to get the impression of how incredibly holy the Zoom experience was. You know, Zoom, I see you guys online. I know you're on Zoom, and I know a lot transmits through that. And sometimes we think of it as having a limiting factor. But the way the Spirit showed up, there RFL Apache was on the screen, and Adam, and we filled it there with our faces. And we'd been sending some information back and forth, so we were coming to it with some grounded knowing of history that was being uncovered. We had an inkling, Ken and I did, about what Kinamakundi means and knowing about how this piecework was coming together. And so I stumbled through an introduction, as you might do, and we had the getting to know you moments. And it got to the heart of who is Kinamakundi. And RFL Apache turned, and he had a beaver skin on the back of his chair. He said, Kinamakundi means beaver, named after our great leader, of which our current chief, that's his ancestor. Now, I've thought about it then and since about beavers, about how determined they are, how they build things, and how their spirits are alive, especially through Native American culture, because of what they offer, but the liveliness they hold in the water. They're part of that story of creation many Native tribes have about Sky Woman, when Sky Woman comes down and encounters the water animals of life. And so we think of the attributes of who would have been Emperor Kinamakundi. And I asked about pronunciation too, because I've heard that name pronounced so many different ways. And I anticipate that it'll continue to be pronounced in so many different ways. But in that moment, he said, Kinamakundi and there was an opening of the heart. You could hear it soften in the space. Do you know the difference it makes when you're on email or on paper, and then when you get to be face to face? And it's no longer the Piscataway Indian Nation. Some folks gather somewhere out there. We think about the ties to the land, but do we have people to attach it to? And so many times we know that as we're talking about Native history in this country, we tend to think in the past. We tend to think about the harm that has been done, which is very important to unearth and to name and claim. But sometimes we have a very difficult time naming the modern reality of a living people and the traditions that they hold, and the way we can sit in a room and hear the wisdom and honor the heritage that has been, and come to terms with some of our own heritage. And I think that's part of the challenge, is going into this, each step, not knowing what it might require of me or of us, but feeling led by the Spirit that has been one connecting point to another. Do you know sometimes when things feel like utter work, it's hard to get them going? And then other times when the Spirit is gently blowing and nudging you past your comfort experience so that you stand on holy ground? Kind of like at the Ascension, I imagine, when you're looking up at the amazing things that have happened and you're stunned, and then you're hearing the call, how do I apply all this to life going forward? Now here's where it gets, I don't even know the word. I felt led to share in that moment about something more personal to me. I wanted to do more listening on that call, but this felt important to share. And it also connects to you, because I've been working on my sabbatical Lilly grant application that I find out about in August. And a big piece of that is wanting to do a heritage piece, to understand more, to go to Mississippi, where both lines of my family come from, and to go with my parents on a road trip. We're going to go around Mississippi next June, and we're going to go to the places where we have graves of ancestors, to see current family members and go to the churches that have dotted our family line, both sides in Mississippi, going back many generations. But you know that when I started to do that work, as many of you may have done, is you're starting to see what happened before Mississippi. What happened in those branches as you tend to follow them, especially some people who have like several European countries in their heritage or other conglomerations of things. So I started to follow one particular line. This is my maternal grandfather line. John Leonard Posey, who I did get to know in my lifetime. My mom recently had given me his medallion that he got when he graduated from high school, 1917. The Posey line. I started tracking that Posey line, and from what I could tell online, and you can find a magical amount of information online. Be careful out there. Try to cross-verify, and I think that I did this right, but it's amazing how many people out there have put together some of their heritage lines, and you'd be surprised at some of that directional work that you can do. So I started tracing Posey, and it goes from Mississippi, and there was some time maybe in a little bit of Alabama, and then in the Carolinas, maybe time in Virginia, but then guess where it landed? I started seeing it. Port Tobacco, Maryland. Yeah. Francis Posey came over in the early 1600s, likely as an indentured servant, landed first in Virginia, and then found his way to Maryland. So he would have been a landing in Maryland sometime, maybe just at the same time or after the time in which Kitimakundi's tribes would have been active in southern Maryland. Do you know how interesting it is when you've put all of a story together and then you realize that you might be sitting across from or talking about people that were ancestors living in a time in which your very ancestor was living in proximity and geography? Especially when you thought that, oh, my family's from one place, and then to find out many states away, to a place that you've come later in your journey and become a spiritual leader at a church that's named for a leader that was of that time in which your ancestor came to this country. What that can do for you. Yeah. So I shared that information, not knowing where to go, but just feeling like I and the connectional reality of that spiritual portal that was being opened up in the moment. And so we sat there, and Arif Alapachi said, "We know Posey." There's a Posey who, in his will, he's an environmentalist, and in his will, he left our tribe, our nation, land. And he said, up until this point, it's the only land that we have and we hold as a nation, thanks to the generosity of this Posey. I can't describe to you what it feels like when someone says something like, "We know Posey." Yeah. Because I was nervous going into this conversation. I know the realities. I know of the realities. I can't know the full reality of this ongoing whiteness and European held history that we hold, many of us, in our bodies, holding both a shame and an unknowing and an uncertainty. And to know then that in that moment, yes, there is complicated history and dark history and things that we own up to and things that we reckon with. But I wasn't expecting anything like that. To be told, we know Posey. I've done a little bit of work that covered Richard Posey. This wasn't that long ago. It was in the 20th century. Very dedicated to the land. That there have been archival sites that have come up so that they can find ongoing artifacts and work in the preservation and support of the Piscataway Indian Nation. But he believed so much in that work. And I'm guessing that in some way he knew that intertwined ongoing history of Francis Posey, which I assume to be our shared ancestor, that in his will, he dedicated that land and formed a relationship over time with Turkey Tayak. And to this day, as Arif Alapachi tells me, it is the only land that they currently hold. I haven't known fully what to do with this. I've been digesting it, but it doesn't belong in the tomb or the dusty shelf. It belongs with you. And it's a gift I was given, and it's a gift I want to turn back and offer to you, especially the first part of this journey. When we're asked, are your hearts open? Would they be ready to receive? Be ready to listen if someone from Piscataway Indian Nation came into our midst? Knowing that we reside on holy ground and that this building and this space, this campus, has been dedicated for deeply spiritual purposes. Can we acknowledge that between the knowing and the unknowing that is the ascension, that in this moment of such deep heartache and the grief that we hold about what we feel has ascended and gone off, never be seen again, that we can look at the messengers, the emissaries that God has put before us and nudges us onward into healing relationship. Because if it's one thing I know about KC, and I've known from the very beginning, because you've told me and I've seen it up close and personal, is that we are a space for healing. How many times in the early 70s and since have people who have had hard interactions with religions or families or some aspect of this world come into the space and are in good company? Because we take our brokenness and we form it into belonging, and we think that we represent and we mirror the kingdom of God. This morning, friends, I've set a lot before you. And I don't expect it all to have sunk in the way that it has for me and will continue to, but I have to wonder, 7 years in, is my 7 year. We know that 7 is a really important biblical number. It doesn't feel to me that it's accident that in my 7th year I get grounded to another part of my purpose in your midst. How could I know? How could anyone know the ways that our intergenerational connections might bring us to just the spot that we are for the ongoing bridging of relationship that we have to do? So lest you think, my friends, that your lineage and your history and your ancestry are far removed from this moment, in the spiritual portal of God, it's all brought forth here to the community of saints who have gone before us, charting Columbia, and the beautiful people who have founded KC, that we can continue to learn together and involve and evolve into a greater space of awareness for our world. And that in and of itself is countercultural. So alongside all of the actions that we are taking, and I encourage you in them, of advocacy, of writing representatives, of showing up on the front lines with immigrants, consider the movement of peoples and the relationships that can be yet built and that will survive us come what may. I invite you in to that space of that resurrection together.